know this. The Republican Party is waging an all-out war on democracy. Since the 2010 elections, 22 states, almost all controlled by Republicans, have passed laws making it harder or downright impossible for American citizens to exercise the most important right in any democracy, the right to choose their own leaders. The most obvious example of the GOP's new war on democracy is, of course, voter ID suppression laws, which require people to bring photo identification with them to the polls. Republicans say they're about stopping voter fraud. But since voter fraud doesn't actually exist, that's just cover for their real purpose, stopping black people and even poor and urban white people who disproportionately lack voting IDs, plus elderly and students, from voting. This isn't some conspiracy theory either. Voter ID suppression laws have worked just as Republicans intended. A recent study by the Government Accountability Office found that they significantly reduced black turnout during the 2012 elections, just as their Republican sponsors hoped and planned. And really, voter ID suppression laws are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Republican Party's all-out assault on voting rights. States like North Carolina and Ohio, for example, have cut back early voting and voting on the Sunday before Election Day, both of which are very popular in the black community. Republican Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, meanwhile, has helped officials in 27 states kick millions of people off the voting rolls with a program called Interstate Crosscheck that reporters have shown to be nothing more than a cover for a nationwide voter suppression scheme. So it's been a bad few years for voting rights. But now Democrats are fighting back. As the New York Times reported today, groups close to the Hillary Clinton campaign have filed lawsuits in key battleground states that, if successful, could strike down some of the worst voter suppression laws. Meanwhile, at an event in Texas today, Hillary Clinton herself took a big public stand against the Republican Party's war on voting, calling it a sweeping effort to disenfranchise the poor, the young, and people of color. Take a look.
We have a responsibility to say clearly and directly what's really going on in our country. Because what is happening is a sweeping effort to disempower and disenfranchise people of color, poor people, and young people from one end of our country to the other.
Bruce. Well, Clinton went to outline ways we can expand the voter rolls and called on all states to put in place 20-day early voting periods. So are we witnessing a real turning of the tide in the fight over voting rights? Or is this just a smart campaign move by the Clinton team? Or both? Let's ask Katherine Culliton-González, Senior Attorney and Director of Voter Advancement at the Voter Protection at the Advancement Project. Katherine, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Great to see you, too.
Thanks for having us.
So first off, your thoughts on Hillary's speech today?
I think it's a wonderful first step forward in the fight for voting rights, and I think people could interpret it politically, but let's be honest, the Democratic Party is also guilty of voting rights violations. I wish that, particularly in the South, if you look at redistricting and you look at some of the reactions to changing demographics in the South, in Texas, where she spoke, that's been, some folks in the Democratic Party that have been troublesome as well, too. I'll just tell you, my first voting rights case was against officials who were part of the Democratic Party in Penns Grove, New Jersey, a number of years ago. So I think, people get the impression that this is a political issue, but we're a nonpartisan group, and we know, millions of voters across the country who are fighting hard for their voting rights and really welcome what Hillary Clinton said today and commend her for that, and we hope that all the parties would adopt such a stance. Yeah.
She talked today about a sweeping effort to disempower and disenfranchise voters, which is essentially what Pennsylvania Republican Chairman Rob Gleason admitted the voter suppression laws were about just a couple of years ago. Here he is.
Mm-hmm. Do you think all the attention drawn to voter ID affected last year's elections?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think we probably had a better election. Think about this. We cut Obama by 5%, which was big. A lot of people lost sight of that. He won. He beat McCain by 10%, and he beat Romney by 5%. I think that probably photo ID had helped a bit in that.
Why do some people believe in mass voter fraud when it's like less frequently seen than the Loch Ness Monster?
You're probably even less frequently seen. So that quote reminds me of our Pennsylvania voter ID litigation where, Advancement Project and the ACLU and really the people of Pennsylvania were able to overturn the strict voter ID law. So part of the proof was that there really was no voter fraud. And across the country, we're seeing that as really an excuse and for voter suppression laws. And voter fraud is extremely and exceedingly rare. And so I really appreciate the coverage so the American people know the facts. Our elections are not being stolen by voter fraud. Politicians are manipulating the rules to try to keep, regular everyday voters from being able to vote through, these strict photo ID laws and other restrictions, like they're through the cross-check system you were speaking about, trying to purge voters from the rolls. They're all based on the premise that there's voter fraud that doesn't really exist.
Right. It seems, just thinking about it, it's like if you were not eligible to vote, and you vote, you're facing prison time. Who in their right mind is going to do that? It seems, my understanding is that nationwide there are maybe 30 or 40 times a year that people get busted for, quote, voter fraud. And it's almost always like somebody voting for their mother who has dementia and they figure, well, I'll just fill out the ballot. Or it's a felon who doesn't realize that he or she lives in a state where felons can't vote. Is that pretty much the case? Is that...
Right. There's actually been many studies about this, and it's come up in the litigation in all of these cases. But for about a decade, the Department of Justice, tried to prosecute voter fraud and found none. And there's been a decade-long study of voter fraud, and the actual number of cases that are prosecuted is less than 30 or 40 a year. Those are the number of allegations a year. When it comes down to like naming a name and saying, this maybe allegedly happened, and then, the number of convictions is exceedingly rare. So, it's about one per state for every decade, and it's not the kind of fraud that any of these voter suppression laws would help at all.
Right. My recollection is the Bush administration spent $74 million trying to investigate, or some mind-boggling amount of money. But in any case, what's really interesting is that in Hillary Clinton's speech, she didn't just call out the voter suppression efforts. She also offered some positive solutions. The 20-day early voting period nationwide, things like that, instant registration, same-day voter registration, which was just rolled out, I think, in Vermont this week. What are the kind of things that we should be doing?
Those are excellent measures. I have to say we are a racial justice group, and I know that these forms of voter suppression and the barriers and the lack of access have a disparate impact on poor people, on young people, on the elderly, on veterans, and then particularly on voters of color. So I think that expanding access is really important. In states that don't have early voting, you see a lot of long lines. Working people can't make it to the polls between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Or when those days of early voting were cut in Florida, that's what led to the terribly long lines. They're just very disheartening in 2012. And so it's very important that there is, same-day registration for folks who move a lot. It's done in most every other country in the world. We don't have a two-step process in other countries. And for early voting, and really, we believe that we should have in our Constitution a specific and fundamental right to vote, and that should be part of state constitutions as well. And finally, we do need to restore the Voting Rights Act. Hillary Clinton talked about the Supreme Court striking down a critical portion of the Voting Rights Act and, struck a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act in the Deep South. We do need to restore that and protect our most fundamental rights.
Right. The affirmative right to vote was not written into the Constitution, as Rehnquist pointed out in the decision of Bush v. Gore.
Right.
You actually have no right to vote for an elector or for president of the United States. And the reason why was because at that point in time, when they were writing the Constitution, there were a lot of human beings, women and people of color specifically, that they didn't want to vote.
Right.
And if they had written into the Constitution that persons or even citizens had the right to vote, then that would have extended the franchise to women instantly. How do we, we're past that time. Slavery's over. Women have rights. How do we get it in? Are you proposing a constitutional amendment?
Yes, Advancement Project is, and so we have a right to vote campaign and program, and we're starting at the state level. So very similar to the ballot measures that you see in marriage equality, and it's working. So we need that for voting rights as well, too. We need an affirmative constitutional right to vote at the local level, at the state level. We need to, put back the protections of the Voting Rights Act and in the U.S. Constitution, if we had an affirmative specific right to vote that was enumerated, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but the case law, as you say, is really complicated. But rather than having negatives, we would have positives that, of course, everybody has the right to vote. And that's what our country is built on. It's built on democracy, and it's not built on a messy system of all kinds of different rules depending on where you live, and with the ability of politicians to manipulate your vote. It's supposed to be one person, one vote, the ballot boxes where we are all equal in America.
Absolutely. Period. End of sentence. Yeah. Katherine, great to see you again. Thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you very much.